over here. What's your response? Look this way, please.
One more question. How are you holding up?
I am Zora Vale, Chief Executive Officer.
6 weeks from now, I would stand in a marble lobby in front of 40 reporters and a wall of cameras, and I would not cry. I want you to remember that while I tell you the rest of this, because on the Thursday I'm about to describe, standing in a doorway I thought I knew by heart, all I had in my hands was a bouquet of red roses, a red gift bag with tissue paper crinkling at the top, and absolutely no idea that the man I had married 14 months earlier had already decided I was disposable. Rewind with me. Before I take you through that door, hit subscribe, because I promise you, the way this story ends is not the way it starts, and you do not want to miss where we land. My name is Zora Kingsley, and I need to tell you how I became Mrs. Cho, because it matters for everything that came after, and because I think a lot of you are going to recognize pieces of yourselves in the woman I was before that Thursday, before I learned the difference between being loved and being managed. I grew up in Charlotte, raised mostly by my grandmother, a woman named Odette Kingsley, who cleaned hotel rooms for 31 years before she saved enough, dollar by careful dollar, to buy a controlling stake in a struggling boutique hospitality company nobody else wanted. She used to come home smelling like bleach and lavender linen spray and tell me, while she soaked her feet in a plastic basin at the kitchen table, that one day the name Kingsley would sit somewhere important, and I should make sure it sat there for the right reasons. She never lived to see the company grow into Havenwell, which now quietly runs event operations and guest experience for some of the most photographed hotels on the East Coast, and increasingly across Asia. When she passed, she left the whole thing to me, structured through a trust so airtight that my name never technically had to appear on anything public. On paper, Havenwell belonged to K. Kingsley Holdings. Almost nobody outside a small circle of lawyers and board members knew that the K stood for me. The company itself had nearly failed twice before it ever turned a real profit. Once when a lawsuit from a disgruntled former partner nearly emptied its accounts, and once when my grandmother, stubborn even in her final years, refused a buyout offer from a much larger hospitality group because she didn't like the way the man across the table spoke to the waitress who brought our coffee. I used to think that story was about pride. I understand now it was about exactly the same instinct she was trying to teach me, that the way someone treats a person they think doesn't matter tells you everything about who they actually are underneath the negotiation. I liked it that way, more than I think is entirely healthy in hindsight. I liked walking into a ballroom as the woman fixing the seating chart and adjusting the lighting cues, not the woman who owned the company doing the fixing. My grandmother used to say, money makes people either kinder or more honest, and rarely both, and she wanted me to know which kind of person was standing in front of me before that person knew what I was worth on paper. I built my whole adult life around that lesson. I am not sure, some days, whether it protected me or simply delayed the damage. I still remember the last conversation I had with her, 3 weeks before she passed, sitting on the edge of her hospital bed with her hand wrapped around mine, papery and cool. She told me she had spent 31 years learning exactly how a certain kind of family speaks when they think nobody important is listening, the tone they use with a maid that they would never use with a guest, and that I should pay closer attention to that tone than to anything printed on a business card. I told her, half joking, that I didn't plan on marrying into a family like that. She squeezed my hand and said, in the dry voice she used when she thought I was being naive, that nobody ever plans on it, sweetheart. They just wake up one morning already inside it. I laughed it off at the time. I think about that conversation now, more than almost any other memory I have of her. That is how I was standing in a ballroom in Manhattan 3 years before that Thursday, clipboard in hand, wearing a plain black blazer that could have belonged to catering staff or to the woman quietly financing the entire evening when Jae-won Cho walked in. He was the son the tabloids loved to photograph and never quite managed to photograph, honestly, if that makes sense. Cho Day Group had its name on shipping terminals, a sprawling private security division, and a growing chain of 5-star hotels across 3 continents. And Jae-won was the heir everyone assumed was next in line. The one profile writers described as controlled, unreadable, and cold in every piece that failed to get him to smile for a camera. In person, across a ballroom with the string quartet tuning behind him, he did not look cold to me. He looked like a man who had been told his entire life exactly who he was permitted to be, and was quietly, carefully testing the edges of that cage, the way you press your thumb against a bruise just to confirm it still hurts. His mother, Madame Jae-won Cho, arrived 20 minutes later in a coat that cost more than most people's cars, took one look at me straightening a centerpiece, and asked me, without glancing up from her phone, to have someone bring her sparkling water with no ice. I brought it to her myself. I smiled the entire time. I did not tell her I could have purchased the ballroom out from under her son's event. That felt, at the time, like restraint. I understand now it was the first of 100 small moments where I chose to disappear a little, rather than make anyone in that family uncomfortable. Jae-won found me later near the kitchen doors and apologized for his mother in a voice pitched low enough that it embarrassed him more than it embarrassed me. "She does that," he said. "Assumes. It's not personal, it's just a reflex she's had my whole life." I told him it was fine, because that is what I had trained myself to say. And he studied me for a moment like he didn't quite believe the word fine had ever once been true coming out of my mouth. He asked my name. I told him Zora, nothing more. And he asked whether Zora had dinner plans that Friday. I told him Zora would think about it, and I walked away before he could see how badly my hands were shaking, because nobody that composed had ever looked at me like I was the only interesting thing in a room full of important people. He called the following morning, before 9, which I would later learn was unusual for him, and asked if Friday could actually be Wednesday instead, because he didn't like the idea of waiting 4 more days to see whether I'd say yes. I told him that was either very charming or very impatient, and he said, without missing a beat, that his mother would tell me it was always both at once. I laughed for real that time, the first genuine laugh I'd had in weeks, and some small, unguarded part of me decided right then that I liked the sound of his voice when he wasn't performing for a room. I want to be honest with you about something, because it matters for what comes later. I fell for him slowly, and then all at once, the way you fall down a staircase, and for most of a year I never told him what Havenwell actually was, because I wanted, just once in my life, to know for certain that a man loved the woman with the clipboard and not the number sitting quietly in her bank account. By the time I told him, 8 months in, he already loved me, or so I believed with every part of myself I had left undefended. He laughed when I finally said it, actually laughed out loud in the middle of a diner booth, and said it explained why I negotiated hotel contracts like I'd been born doing it. His mother took the news very differently. She went quiet the way people go quiet when they are recalculating a plan rather than absorbing a fact, though I did not know to be frightened of that quiet yet. We married 14 months before that Thursday, in a small ceremony his family tolerated more than celebrated. I remember standing beside him at the head table, my hand resting on his sleeve, watching his mother rise with a glass of champagne and a smile that reached exactly as far as her cheekbones and stopped. She spoke for almost 4 minutes about legacy, about continuity, about the weight of a family name built across 3 generations, and she never once said mine. She referred to me only as Jae-won's choice, the way you'd describe a decision he'd made about which car to lease. And when she finally sat down, the room applauded politely, and Jae-won squeezed my hand under the table like that squeeze was supposed to be enough to cover the gap where my own name should have been. I told myself that was simply how families like his spoke to one another, formal and clipped, nothing personal in it. I told myself a great many things that first year that I am considerably less sure of now. Looking back, there were small warnings scattered through those 14 months, the kind you only recognize once someone hands you the flashlight. At our engagement dinner, the night before our wedding, his phone lit up twice on the tablecloth before he finally excused himself and stepped onto the balcony to take the call. I watched him through the glass for a while, his shoulders squared, his free hand pressed flat against the railing, his back to the room the entire 11 minutes he was out there. When he came back in, I asked, lightly, who calls a groom the night before his own wedding for 11 minutes? He said it was a supplier issue at the Busan property, kissed my temple, and refilled my wine before I could ask a second question. I let the second question go. I have wondered since whether that call was to Sohan's family, confirming logistics for a wedding that was never supposed to be mine at all. A few months into our marriage, looking for a stapler in his study on a lazy Sunday afternoon, I opened a desk drawer that stuck a little on its runners and found a photograph tucked beneath a stack of old letters. A young woman I did not recognize, laughing at something outside the frame, the photo worn soft at the corners like it had travelled through a lot of hands before it reached his drawer. Madame Cho, who happened to be visiting that same week, walked past the open study door, saw what I was holding, and went very still in a way that I registered but did not yet know how to read. "An old family matter," she said, and took the photograph gently from my fingers with two hands, the way you'd take something breakable from a child. I let it go. I let almost everything go that first year, because I loved him. And because loving someone, I believed then, meant choosing not to interrogate every small silence he left lying around the apartment. I was in Singapore for 12 days, closing the operating agreement for Havenwell's newest property when I decided, on the 10th day, to fly home 2 days early. I remember sitting in my hotel room that night, the deal finally signed, scrolling through photos of our wedding on my phone instead of sleeping, missing him in that specific, embarrassing way you miss someone when you've been away, just long enough to forget the small annoyances and remember only the good parts. I called the airline before I could talk myself out of it. Our first anniversary fell that Saturday. I bought roses at the airport because the flower shop near our building always sold out by Friday afternoon. And I bought him a leather travel case from a boutique near Marina Bay because he had mentioned once, in passing, months earlier, that his old one was falling apart at the seams. I remember everything anyone I love mentions in passing. That used to feel like devotion. I understand now it was also a kind of vigilance I had trained into myself without ever noticing I was doing it. A habit of paying such close attention that I hoped, somewhere underneath the hope, it might keep me safe. The car dropped me at the penthouse a little after 4 that afternoon. The elevator smelled like the roses I was holding. I remember thinking the apartment felt too still for a Thursday, and telling myself he was probably still at the office, and I could set out the roses and the gift bag and surprise him properly the moment he walked through the door. Our housekeeper, Odalis, who normally would have greeted me from the kitchen, was nowhere in sight, which I noted and dismissed in the same half-second, the way you notice a single cloud and decide it means nothing about the weather. I heard the voices before I reached the bedroom. I want to describe this carefully, because for weeks afterward I replayed it so many times I started to doubt my own memory, the way you doubt anything you've looked at too closely for too long. The bedroom door stood open, maybe 8 inches. Late afternoon sun came through the window behind the bed, warm and gold, the kind of light that makes everything look staged, like a photograph someone arranged on purpose. The bedside lamp was on despite the daylight, and it threw a long shadow up the wall behind him, stretched and distorted the way lamp shadows always are, fingers spread wide like claws dragging across the pale paint. For one full heartbeat, before my mind caught up with my eyes, he did not look like my husband bent over someone in our bed. He looked like something else entirely, something with too many teeth, reaching for more than it had any right to take. Then my mind caught up, and it was so much worse, because what I was looking at was real, and it did not need a shadow to be monstrous. There was a woman in our bed. Jae-won was leaning over her, his shirt half open, and neither of them heard the door. I did not scream. I think about that a lot, how quiet I managed to be in the worst moment of my adult life. I said his name once, and he turned around, and here is the part that broke something in me that has never fully gone back together the same shape it was before. He did not flinch. He did not scramble for a sheet or stammer an excuse the way people do when they've been caught at something they know is wrong. He looked at me the way you look at an appointment that arrived on the wrong day, mild irritation layered over something colder underneath it. "You were supposed to be in Singapore until Sunday," he said. "Not, I'm sorry. Not this isn't what it looks like." A logistics complaint, delivered to his own wife, as though I had thrown off a schedule that mattered more than I did. The woman in the bed pulled the sheet up but did not otherwise move to leave, which told me, even before anyone explained anything to me, that she did not consider herself the one who owed this room an apology. I set the roses down on the dresser because my arms had started shaking and I did not want to drop them, which is a strange thing to worry about in a moment like that, but grief does strange things to your hands before it reaches the rest of you. "Who is she?" I said. It came out steadier than I felt. Jae-won sat up, buttoned his shirt with the unhurried calm of a man closing a laptop after a routine meeting, and said, "This is So-hyun. She's a Yoon." He said it like the family name should mean something to me on its own, and eventually I would understand why it was supposed to. In that moment, I only understood that he had spoken her family's name before he had spoken one single word of explanation to his wife of 14 months. I asked him to send her out of the room so we could speak alone, and he actually checked his watch before agreeing, as though I were cutting into something scheduled. So-hyun gathered her clothes with the unbothered efficiency of a woman who had done this before, in this apartment, possibly in this bed, and walked past me into the hallway without a single word, her eyes flicking over me once, head to foot, the way you assess a piece of furniture you're deciding whether to keep or replace. I stood in my own bedroom holding a red gift bag I had carried through 2 international airports, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in how total it was, that my marriage had ended sometime before I ever walked into that room. I was only now, embarrassingly late, finding out. If you were standing in my heels right then, tell me in the comments what city you're watching this from, because I promise you, someone in this thread has stood exactly where I stood, in a doorway that used to feel safe, watching the floor quietly disappear from under them. Jae-won did not apologize once we were alone. He explained, which is a different thing entirely, and somehow crueler for the difference. He told me, in the same measured tone he used for board presentations, that So-hyun had been promised to him since he was 9 years old, a pact struck between his grandfather and her grandfather. 2 shipping empires meant to merge the way empires have merged for 1,000 years, through the careful arrangement of their children's lives. He told me his mother had never stopped believing that pact was still binding, marriage to me or not, and that over the last 2 months, at his mother's insistence, he had begun re-establishing the relationship, a phrase I will hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. "You knew," I said. "You knew this before you ever married me." "I thought I could make it work both ways," he said, which was not a denial. It was, I realized slowly, standing there with roses wilting on the dresser behind me, an admission dressed up as a strategy, and somehow that was worse than an outright lie would have been. A lie at least respects you enough to try to fool you. This was closer to being handed a memo about a decision that had already been finalized without you in the room. I asked him what both ways was supposed to mean for me, his wife, the woman who had flown home 2 days early with an anniversary gift still in its bag, and for a moment he actually looked, briefly, like a man searching for a real answer instead of a rehearsed one. It didn't last. Whatever flicker of honesty crossed his face closed back over almost immediately, and he said something I have never fully managed to forgive. Not because it was shouted or vicious, but because of how calmly he said it, like a line he had already rehearsed with someone else in the family. "You were never supposed to find out this way," he said. I was going to handle it quietly, once things were settled with the board. Handle it, like I was a line item on a quarterly report, something to be adjusted before the next earnings call. That is when his mother walked in, because of course she did, because I would learn in the weeks that followed that Madame Jae-won Cho did not simply happen to be nearby when her son's marriage detonated. She had been managing the detonation, quietly and patiently, from somewhere close by the entire time. She entered our bedroom in low heels that made no sound on the hardwood, took in the roses on the dresser and the gift bag still hanging from my wrist, and said, without any preamble at all, "This is exactly why I told him not to marry in a hurry." I asked her, as calmly as I could manage with my whole life rearranging itself in real time, whether she had known about So-hyun. She did not bother lying either, which I have come to think of as the one honest thing that entire family ever gave me. She told me the Yoon Pact predated my existence by 2 generations, that families like theirs did not build empires on feelings, that I had been, in her own words, a pleasant interruption, and that it was time for the interruption to end with dignity, for everyone's sake, especially mine, since a public scandal would do far more lasting damage to a woman with my kind of business relationships than it would ever do to her sons. That was the moment I understood she saw my career, the thing I had built quietly with my own 2 hands out of my grandmother's savings, as leverage to use against me, rather than an achievement worth a single ounce of her respect. I reached past her for the framed photo on the nightstand, our wedding photo, the 2 of us laughing under string lights at a ceremony his family had tolerated more than celebrated, because some stubborn, wounded part of me wanted to take at least that one true thing with me when I left. Jae-won caught my wrist, not violently, but hard enough that the frame slipped from my fingers on its way down and struck the corner of the nightstand. The glass spider-webbed into 100 hairline cracks, running straight across both our faces, and nobody in that room moved to pick it up. I remember staring at the fracture running directly between his smile and mine, thinking some part of the universe had simply beaten me to the truth by about 1 full second. I left that penthouse with the roses still in my hand, because some stubborn, wounded part of me refused to let go of them even then. And a wedding ring I would slide off in the elevator, and absolutely nothing else that had ever felt like mine inside that apartment. I went back to the penthouse 4 days later, in the middle of a weekday when I knew Jae-won would be at the office, to collect the rest of my clothes. Odalis let me in without a word, her eyes red-rimmed in a way that told me she had been crying about something that had nothing to do with dust or linens. While I packed, she stood in the doorway of the closet, twisting a dish towel in her hands, and finally said, quietly, that she was sorry, that she hadn't known how to tell me sooner without losing her position, but that Madame Cho had been having tea with a woman from the Yoon family every second Tuesday for well over a year, always while I was travelling for Havenwell, always cleared from the household calendar before I got home. She said the staff had a name for those Tuesdays that they never used in front of me. I thanked her, and I meant it, and I told her none of what happened in that apartment was ever her fault to carry. She hugged me at the door, quick and fierce, the way you hug someone you're afraid you won't see again, and I never did work in that building again, though I think about her kindness more often than I think about almost anything else from that year. I want to tell you what I did with the next 3 weeks, because this is the part of the story where a lot of women's stories quietly end, in a guest room at a friend's apartment, grieving a life that got repossessed out from under them with no warning and no receipt. I want to tell you why mine didn't end there. My best friend, Dominique Faraday, opened her door that night without asking a single question, just pulled me inside and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders like I was something that had washed up on shore in the middle of a storm. Dominique is a business journalist, sharp enough to make grown executives sweat through their suits in interviews, and loyal enough that she once flew across an ocean on 48 hours' notice because I mentioned, offhand, that a hotel opening was stressing me out. She let me cry for 2 full days before she said a single word about strategy, and I love her for that timing more than almost anything else she has ever done for me in 15 years of friendship. On the 3rd day, she sat across from me at her kitchen table, slid a mug of coffee toward me, and asked one question that changed the shape of everything that followed. What does Havenwell actually own a piece of inside the Cho portfolio? I had never once thought to ask that question about my own husband's family, because I had spent our entire marriage keeping my business and my marriage in separate, carefully sealed rooms, out of some old instinct my grandmother planted in me about not wanting to be loved for the wrong reasons. So Dominique and I spent that entire afternoon pulling contracts, and what we found made me set my coffee down very slowly. Havenwell, under the anonymous banner of K. Kingsley Holdings, held the exclusive event operations and guest experience contract for 4 Cho Day Group flagship hotels, including the one scheduled to reopen in 6 weeks as the crown jewel of Jae-won's incoming era as chief executive. Nobody in the Cho family had ever connected K. Kingsley Holdings to the woman they had spent 14 months treating as a pleasant interruption. I had built my entire company on the principle of staying quiet about what I owned, and it turned out that quiet had been sitting on a piece of leverage I never knew I was holding. I am not going to pretend the days that followed were some clean, righteous plan I executed without a single doubt. I doubted myself constantly, some nights until 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of Dominique's guest room. I wondered whether using my business felt like becoming exactly the kind of transactional person Madame Cho already assumed I was underneath the clipboard and the good manners. I wondered whether wanting any of it back, even the truth, made me small. Dominique told me something during those weeks that has stayed with me since, sitting across from her at that same kitchen table with a second pot of coffee going cold between us. She said there is a real difference between using people and simply refusing to keep hiding the truth any longer, and that for 14 months I had let an entire family use my silence as a kind of cover for their own choices. It was time, she said, to stop being quiet about all of it, not to punish anyone, but because a lie only survives as long as the person it hurts agrees to keep protecting it. The following Monday, I walked into Havenwell's own offices for the first time in 3 weeks, and I want to tell you what that felt like, because it mattered more than I expected. My director of operations, a sharp-eyed man named Julian Marsh, who had worked with my grandmother before he ever worked with me, stood up from his desk the second he saw my face and asked, simply, "What do you need? Not why are you here, not are you all right, just what do you need?" The way people speak to someone whose judgment they've never once doubted. I called a small meeting that afternoon, 4 of my most senior people around a table, and I told them, without going into the parts that weren't theirs to carry, that Havenwell would be reassessing its relationship with a major client over the coming weeks, and that I needed the reassessment handled the way we handled everything, quietly, thoroughly, and without a single loose thread anyone could later use against us. Nobody in that room asked me a single personal question. They simply started pulling files. I sat at the head of that table, in the company my grandmother built out of 31 years of other people's mess, and felt, for the first time since that Thursday, entirely like myself again. There was a night, somewhere in the middle of that stretch, when I sat on the edge of Dominique's guest bed at 2 in the morning and asked her, out loud, whether any of this made me exactly like Madame Cho, someone willing to use a business as a weapon to get what she wanted. Dominique came and sat beside me without turning on the light, and told me the difference wasn't the tool, it was the reason you picked it up. Madame Cho built a decade of silence to protect people from consequences they deserved. I was ending a decade of silence to hand consequences back to the people who had actually earned them. I didn't fully believe her that night. I believe her more now, looking back, than I did in the moment, which I think is simply how it feels to be honest with yourself in real time instead of in hindsight. A week into that stretch, So Hun-yoon came to Dominique's apartment building unannounced, standing in the lobby in sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and asked the doorman to send up word that she wanted 5 minutes. I almost said no. I am glad, in the end, that I said yes, because what she told me in that lobby filled in a piece of the picture I would not have found on my own. She told me, with an honesty I did not expect, and have never fully decided how to feel about, that she had not chosen any of this either. Her family had reminded her of the pact on her 25th birthday, the way you remind someone of an outstanding debt, and she had spent 2 years being quietly, methodically reintroduced into Jae-won's life at his mother's engineering, long before I ever knew her name existed. She told me Madame Cho had personally arranged the chance encounters, the seating charts, the calendar overlaps, with the same precision she brought to everything else. There were dinners you never heard about, she told me, seated to look accidental, months before your wedding. I want you to know I asked to stop, twice, and both times I was told the arrangement wasn't mine to end. So Hun did not apologize to me. I did not expect her to. But she said one thing on her way out that I have turned over in my mind many times since. She said, I don't think either of us was ever actually the one he was choosing. I think we were both just what his mother chose for him, at different times, for different reasons. I believed her. It did not make the bedroom hurt less. It did clarify, sharply, who I was actually up against. There's one word I kept repeating to myself through that stretch of weeks that I want you to sit with for a second, because I think it might be the word that gets some of you through your own version of that doorway. The word was steady. Not strong, not fierce, not any of the words people usually reach for. Just steady. One breath after another. One confirmed fact gathered after another, until the ground under me stopped shifting and slowly started to hold again. Drop that word in the comments below, the one word that got you, or would get you, through a night like mine. 10 days after that Thursday, Madame Cho requested a meeting of her own, on neutral ground, a private dining room at a hotel that was not, pointedly, one of her family's properties. She arrived with a folder and a lawyer who did not say a single word the entire meal. Over tea, she slid the folder across the table, and inside it was a settlement offer, a generous one by most people's standards, attached to a non-disclosure agreement that would have kept me from ever discussing Jae-won, So-hyun, or the marriage again in any public capacity, for the rest of my life, in exchange for a number with a great many zeros in it. "This is not an insult," she said, watching my face carefully. "This is a dignified exit. Take it, and you never have to think about my family again." I looked at the number for a long moment, long enough that I think she believed she had already won, and then I closed the folder and slid it back across the tablecloth toward her. "I don't want your money," I told her, as steadily as I could manage. "I spent 14 months letting your family decide how loud I was allowed to be in my own marriage. I'm not signing another piece of paper that does the same thing for the rest of my life." She studied me for a long moment, something flickering behind her eyes that might have been respect and might have simply been recalculation, and said, quietly, that I would regret it. I told her I had regretted a great many things already that year, and I doubted this would be the one that kept me up at night. She left without finishing her tea. 3 weeks after that Thursday, Havenwell hosted the soft opening gala for the very hotel I had heard so much about, across a dozen conversations I never thought to question, and I attended under my own full name for the first time in that world, dressed the way I wanted, not the way a Cho family dinner had ever quietly required of me. Jae-won's board had absolutely no idea the event's operator of record, Kingsley Holdings, was standing in the room in a deep green dress, discussing staffing logistics with their own head of hospitality. I let 3 glasses of champagne circulate through the room before I found the hotel's general manager and mentioned, quietly, that Havenwell would be reassessing its operating agreement across all 4 Cho properties, effective at the end of the coming quarter. He asked why, in the tone of a man who had never once had to ask that question of a vendor before in his entire career. I told him it had started as a personal matter and had recently become a business one. And I watched him do the math in real time. Watched his expression shift several seconds too late as he understood exactly who he was speaking to. That was the first small crack. Small, quiet, almost polite. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I simply told the truth to the right person at the right moment, and let the truth carry its own weight, the way it always does, eventually, if you're patient enough to give it room. A week later, I sat across from Chodae Group's chief financial officer at his own request, a cautious man named Byung-ho, who clearly had not been told the full picture by anyone above him. He opened with numbers, the way finance men always do when they sense something slipping, offering revised terms, a longer contract window, better margins on our side if we would simply reconsider the timeline. I let him finish his whole prepared speech before I answered. "This was never a pricing conversation," I told him. He set down his pen very slowly. "Then what would it take," he asked, "to fix whatever it actually is?" I told him it wasn't something a renegotiated contract could fix, and that he might want to ask his chairman's wife that same question, because she would know exactly what I meant, even if he didn't yet. He asked, carefully, whether there was anything the family could do to keep Havenwell's contracts in place. I told him the contracts were never really the problem, and watched that land on his face too. The slow arithmetic of a man realizing his company's crisis had started somewhere far more personal than a spreadsheet. Dominique's research, meanwhile, had turned up something far more serious than an old marriage pact, something that had nothing to do with me at all, and everything to do with the kind of family I had actually married into. 3 Chodae hotels, including the flagship about to reopen under Jae-won's name, carried a years-long pattern of safety and labor violations that had been quietly settled and buried long before I ever walked into that first ballroom. The person managing those settlements, the person who had spent a decade ensuring no journalist ever connected the dots, was not Jae-won. It was his mother, working through a compliance officer she had personally installed and personally paid to look the other way. Dominique found her way to a former analyst in that same compliance office, a woman named Noelle Vance, who had quietly resigned 2 years earlier rather than sign off on a falsified inspection report, and who had been waiting, it turned out, a very long time for someone to finally ask her the right question. We met Noelle in a diner outside the city, far enough from anything with the Cho name on it that she agreed to speak on the record. She was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 2 years being quietly disbelieved by every institution she'd tried to raise the alarm with. She told us she had refused to sign the falsified report because a maintenance worker at one of the properties had been hospitalized after a safety failure that report was specifically designed to hide, and that when she pushed the issue up the chain, she was offered a severance package roughly triple her annual salary to simply disappear quietly instead. "I took the money," she said, not meeting my eyes at first. "I'm not proud of that. I told myself I could still talk about it someday, once I found someone who'd actually listen instead of just settling me." Dominique told her we were listening now, and meant it, and by the end of that conversation, Noelle had agreed to put her name to everything, on the record. No severance this time, nothing to disappear quietly for. I understood something else, too. Watching Jae-won across that gala ballroom, laughing easily with investors, playing the role his mother had built for him since he was 9 years old. He was not the architect of what happened to me in that bedroom. He was, in his own way, as managed as I had been, raised inside a family that treated love as a liability to be minimized rather than a life to be actually lived. I thought back, more than once, to the 11 minutes he spent on that balcony the night before our wedding, and wondered how many other 11-minute calls had shaped decisions I never knew were being made about my own life, in rooms I was never invited into, by people who had decided a long time before I existed exactly how this story was supposed to end. It is a strange kind of grief, mourning a man for the choices he never made, for the version of him that might have existed if anyone in his family had ever once rewarded him for courage instead of compliance. I let myself feel that grief, briefly, standing in that ballroom. Then I let it go, because grief for a man's wasted potential is not the same thing as an obligation to keep protecting him from what he'd actually done. That understanding did not excuse a single thing: the coldness in his voice, the calm with which he chose comfort over courage every time it mattered. But it clarified, precisely, who I was really standing across from. It was not a monster wearing my husband's face. It was a woman in low heels who had built one, patiently, over 30 years, and dressed him in her own ambition so completely that he could no longer tell the difference between his choices and hers. 6 weeks after that Thursday, Cho Dae Group held its annual shareholder gala. The same evening, Jae-won was set to be formally announced as incoming chief executive. The newly reopened flagship hotel unveiled behind him like a coronation stage. I was there because Havenwell was, on paper, still the operator of record for the evening. One final contractual obligation before the reassessment I had already set in motion took full effect at midnight. Dominique's exposé went live at exactly 7:40 that evening, timed to the minute, laying out the settled violations, the buried inspection reports, and the paper trail leading directly back to Madame Jae-won Cho, corroborated on the record by Noelle Vance. I watched phones light up across that ballroom in a slow wave, watched investors excuse themselves from conversations mid-sentence, watched the colour drain out of faces that had spent a decade assuming nothing would ever reach them. I walked up to the small stage where the evening's operator was traditionally introduced, took the microphone from the MC's hand with a polite nod, and gave my full name and title to that room for the first time. Jae-won's head came up from across the ballroom the moment I said Zora Kingsley into that microphone, and I watched understanding arrive on his face in stages, the way weather moves across an open field. He started toward the stage, and for a moment I genuinely thought he might try to take the microphone from my hand in front of 200 people. But his mother caught his sleeve, hard, her fingers white around his forearm, and whatever calculation ran behind her eyes told him to stop walking. He stopped. I informed everyone, calmly, in the same voice I had used to negotiate 100 contracts before this one, that Kingsley Holdings was terminating its operating agreement across all 4 Cho Dae hotel properties, effective immediately, citing the very violations breaking across every phone in the room in real time. Somewhere behind me, I heard a board member ask, in a strained whisper that carried further than he intended, whether anyone had known the two names were connected, and nobody answered him, because the honest answer was that only 3 people in that entire ballroom had known, and 2 of them had been actively hiding it from the third. I found Madame Cho's face in the crowd as I stepped down from the stage, expecting fury, and finding instead something quieter and, in its own way, harder to look at directly. It was the specific stillness of a woman watching 30 years of careful architecture come down in under 4 minutes, calculating, even then, out of pure reflex, whether there was still some angle left to salvage. There wasn't. I watched her understand that too, somewhere behind her eyes, before she turned and walked toward the exit without a single word to anyone in that room. I did not mention Sohan. I did not mention the bedroom, or the roses, or the cracked photo frame still sitting, for all I knew, exactly where it had fallen. I let the business speak, because the business was entirely true. And the truth, once you finally let it out of the room, you've spent years keeping it locked inside, does not need you to raise your voice for anyone to hear it clearly. The Yoon family, watching their daughter's prospective marriage suddenly attached to a company hemorrhaging both investors and headlines, withdrew from the pact within the week, with the same clinical efficiency Madame Cho had used to arrange it in the first place. So-hun left without a single backward glance, the same unbothered efficiency I remembered from that afternoon in my bedroom, because I understood by then that she had never actually been fighting for Jae-won. She had been following the only path her own family laid out for her, the same as him. And once that path collapsed underneath everyone standing on it, so did her interest in walking it any further. I heard, much later, that she moved to London that autumn to finish a design degree she'd shelved years earlier at her family's insistence, and I hope, genuinely, that whatever life she's building there is entirely her own this time, chosen rather than assigned. The board, facing a scandal with Madame Cho's fingerprints on every page of it, quietly moved the chief executive announcement to a cousin who had spent the last decade deliberately far away from the family's compliance decisions. Chodae Group's share price fell nearly 19% over the following 2 weeks. 3 major hospitality partners cut ties within the month, and 2 independent hotel review platforms froze the flagship property's listings pending their own inquiries. Jae-won kept his title, his office, his last name, and lost, within a single season, nearly everything that had ever made those things worth wanting. His mother was removed from the family council by relatives who had spent 30 years watching her manage them, and had simply been waiting for a reason with enough weight behind it to finally act. Dominique told me later, from a source still inside the building, that Jae-won spent the week after the gala mostly alone in the penthouse, the lights off more often than on, ordering food that arrived and went cold on the counter because nobody was there to remind him to eat it. I did not feel triumphant when I heard that. I want to be honest about that too. I felt something closer to grief, the specific kind you feel for a person who had every resource in the world to be different and simply never chose to spend a single one of them on courage. Somewhere underneath the grief, though, was something quieter and steadier. The simple relief of finally standing on solid ground after months of not knowing where the floor actually was. He called me once, about a month after the gala, late enough at night that I almost let it go to voicemail. He did not apologize, not really, not in any way that would have changed anything, even if he had. He asked if the photo frame was something I wanted back. I told him, as gently and as honestly as I could manage, that I did not want anything else out of that apartment, that some things are better left exactly where they cracked, as a reminder to whoever lives with them next. I heard him go quiet on the other end of the line, the way his mother used to go quiet, and I understood that quiet, finally, for what it always was. Not thoughtfulness. Just the sound of someone recalculating a plan that had, at long last, run all the way out. Havenwell is opening its own flagship property this spring. 41 stories, my grandmother's name etched into the cornerstone in small, deliberate letters, because some legacies deserve to be spoken loudly, even when the woman who laid the first brick chose to spend her whole life staying quiet. 6 weeks from that Thursday, almost to the day, I stood in a marble lobby in front of 40 reporters and a wall of cameras, my own name on the building behind me for the first time in my life. A reporter near the front, Young, notebook balanced on her forearm, raised her hand and asked if it was true that Havenwell's owner had once worked catering events under an assumed identity for years before revealing herself. I told her it wasn't an assumed identity. It was simply my name, said quietly, in rooms that had never once bothered to ask what it was. She wrote that down like it mattered, and something about watching her write it settled a part of me that had been unsettled for 6 weeks straight. I did not cry that afternoon, because I finally understood something my grandmother tried to tell me a long time before I was ready to actually hear it. Monsters do not always live in the dark, reaching at you from a shadow stretched across a bedroom wall. Sometimes they wear tailored suits, remember your coffee order, and call you a pleasant interruption to your own life. And the only way through a house built like that is to quietly, patiently become someone the monster never once saw coming. Dominique still lives 2 floors below me in the same building I finally bought for myself, and most Sunday mornings we still sit at her kitchen table with the same 2 mugs, though the coffee tastes different now, less like survival and more like something closer to peace. I am not going to tell you I've fallen in love again, because that part of my life is still quiet, still mine, still not owed to anyone watching this screen. I will tell you that I no longer flinch when a lamp throws a strange shadow across a wall at the end of a long day, and that the roses I keep on my own kitchen counter now, I buy for myself, on no particular occasion at all, simply because I like the way they look in the morning light. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments and subscribe for the next one, because trust me, this will not be the last time someone underestimated a quiet woman with a clipboard and everything left to lose.